Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's SIIA Tech Chat. I am delighted to be joined today by Jake Wojcik, who is SVP at SpendHQ. SpendHQ is a complete spend intelligence platform. So, Jake, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Before I jump in, to the questions I want to get to, can you tell us a little bit, what is a spend intelligence platform?
So with Spend Intelligence, one of the things, being a procurement and sourcing professional, we find one of the biggest challenges for procurement leaders today is really actually having their data to be strategic about their day-to-day job. We find that, the challenges associated with spend analytics is, one, they don't have good data to drive sourcing. They really can't, measure compliance, and ultimately demand management becomes a big challenge. So despite all the investments in financial technologies and ERP systems, spend analytics, the market hasn't been able to solve the challenge for procurement leaders to give them data the way they need it.
Got it. Now, SpendHQ was originally created just for your parent company, for your internal use. But today it's one of the leading spend intelligence platforms. So can you talk about this journey? Like, when did you know that there was a market for this internal product that you had?
Well, ultimately, every company in the world spends between 30 to 70% of their revenues on goods and services. So our whole firm was built around the premise of helping companies achieve cost reductions or bottom line savings. And you see so many companies focus on top line revenue and all the financials associated with finance and accounting applications. Ultimately, the procurement leaders never have had this data view that I described before. So our firm, Inside Sourcing Group, our parent company, was founded in 2002 to really bring the kind of in-depth strategic sourcing expertise to the mid-market. And ultimately, data always became a challenge because we'd started engagement to help companies think strategically about their spend. We'd have to gather all this data. We'd develop a spend cube for them, as we describe it. And ultimately, it'd be the best data that they'd ever seen. But we'd come back 2 years later, and we'd find that ultimately the company was still using that same data set, even though it was outdated, almost unusable, but it was the best data that they had. So around the 2008, 2009 timeframe, we really actually were getting asked from our clients to say, you know what, that analysis that you did way back when, we'd love you to refresh that because we love that view. So then we really had an idea to build a business around this. And we're not the only player in spend analytics. There's been a lot of players out there in BI tools and Excel. But what we find, a lot of them had some very inherent challenges, and the focus wasn't truly around analytics for the procurement leader. So ultimately, based on our sourcing expertise and procurement heritage, really built a product, starting with data, making sure that the data was right, and made a very user-friendly UI to make sure that procurement leader and the finance team and everyone else could have that true, accurate view, but also make it very easy for them to interpret the data.
So then, why don't companies adopt this faster? I mean, why is spend visibility so hard for them to achieve?
Yeah, well, part of this comes out of the sense from IT. I mean, so much investment goes in today to, implementing an SAP or an Oracle or these big fancy BI type of solutions. But again, they weren't built for the procurement leader or that spend management professional. So what we find is there's just been a big gap. Typically a company procurement team is dealing with, okay, well, we're getting general ledger data and we're trying to interpret that. And by the way, we have FedEx spelled 50 different ways within our vendor master. And then once we add our P card data and expense data, that problem's extrapolated. So what we find is a lot of companies just, they are stuck looking at very accounting-oriented data. They're living in a world of very fragmented systems. Yesterday, I was at a client that had 15 different ERP systems, P card data, expense management data. When we received that data, I kid you not, Staples was spelled hundreds of ways, coded to hundreds of GL accounts. And ultimately, that's not the way, somebody in the strategic sourcing and procurement profession thinks about data.
So then what advice would you give to executives who are trying to justify the ROI of spend analytics?
Yeah, well, the ROI of spend analytics, I mean, you can't manage what you can't see. And that's probably an overused phrase, but ultimately we find that if you're going to be strategic around procurement, spend analytics is foundational. There's a lot of different technologies that procurement leaders can consider. Procure-to-pay systems, there's e-sourcing systems, there's full spend management suites. But for us, it's really about speed to value. How can we interpret the data in the way that we ultimately could build a strategic sourcing roadmap? And ultimately, that means, how fast can I accelerate the savings process, especially with companies that are going through M&A environments where there's always a cost out synergy, where there's maybe companies in distress. You see this a lot in retail today. But ultimately, the basis is how can I use data to develop a savings roadmap, execute against that roadmap, but ultimately be able to drive compliance. And that's a big theme that we see in the data. Today, we're sitting on $1.5 trillion in data. And this whole correlation between clients saying, you know what, I have a strategy for a category like LTL or temp labor or office supplies. I know who preferred vendors should be, but our data represents that spend is actually going to those preferred vendors, about 50 to 60% of the time. That means if a CFO thinks that, hey, we're going to get $10 million in this savings campaign, it's probably only about 50% of that due to compliance. And spend analytics is a critical factor in identifying where non-compliance and rogue spend is happening. So compliance is a big piece. And then ultimately, the last thing is really thinking through demand management strategies. Ultimately, that's the second bite of the savings apple, where hopefully you can look at spend to say, why are we using 20 vendors to do the same thing? Let's use this data to help consolidate the supply base, develop preferred discounts, really think through compliance to make sure that the savings promise happens. But then, what are we buying? How are we buying it? Are there cheaper items? Do we even need to buy this? And really thinking about the demand equation for again, that second bite of the savings apple.
So, I mean, you talked a little bit about IT and, we have so many systems. You talked about you've spent with clients with multiple ERP systems and such. So can you share with the audience what's the ease of adoption of a spend intelligence platform? I mean, how quickly can you get some of that data cleaned up and integrate with some of their other systems?
Sure. Well, clearly I'm biased towards SpendHQ, but on average, our process, it starts with the data, and data has to be taken through a very in-depth cleansing process. So we find that most clients could be up and running in 4 to 6 weeks on average. What that includes is pulling the data, validating that we have all the data, taking it through a process. We've built an algorithm-based and machine learning process that can typically, get data up to about 75% accurately categorized through an automated fashion. But we find that a necessary evil within spend analytics is you need this human layer. Pick and shovel work, really digging into the data. For example, if we see staples, clearly we'll, and that's a very kind of generic category around office supplies, but they do a lot of things. They could do janitorial supplies, they could do, print, they could do promo. So ultimately, we can't just justify that, hey, the market uses staples for office supplies. We have to develop very specific rules on how clients are using that vendor, and no algorithm can do that on an automated fashion purely. So what we find is the combination of algorithms, machine learning, and then this humanware, so we describe it, will typically get clients over this 97, 98% categorization threshold, which we'll guarantee. But then there's a big piece of training and making sure that folks have how to use it. Just because we give somebody great data doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to use it right. So there is a big education, and that just can't be a one and done type of scenario. This is something that every quarter, this is how you should be using the tool, some of the insights that we see in it. And so we've really worked to build almost a managed service or a professional services component of spend analytics to really show clients, themes in their data that they might not see and how to interpret it so they can link the data ultimately to insights and those insights to their strategy.
Certainly very helpful for finance teams. Jake, thank you so much for your time today. For more information on SpendHQ, you can visit their websites and join us next week for SIIA Tech Chats.